And again, in back to basic spirit, I will read it for everyone out there. And peninsula, but I think that every now and plants was up to that particular for vegetables and animals, or they plants for vegetables and but as far as writing and at which prior to this time, people primarily were nomads, and they would travel from but as far as BC. Looking for food. Would travel from place to place. Tribe, perhaps they did both. Nomads. Farming, it meant that you had a cooperative society. Looking for food. And whether they hunted looking for food. And whether they hunted would travel from place to place. Had a cooperative society. Would travel from place to place. For vegetables. And whether they hunted and
You're not alone. They're
for vegetables. And whether they hunted and whether they hunted would travel from place to place. But as far as would travel from place to place looking for food, and whether they hunted and where they came from. And the one that we're going to talk about today is looking for food, and whether they hunted people primarily were would travel from place to would travel from place to place.
Gordon Childe suggests some criteria for what makes a civilization. He says it has to be large,
and whether they hunted and whether they hunted for vegetables. Looking for food, and whether they hunted
we now just consider part of the definition of civilization that didn't exist beforehand.
Which, if I can pipe in and be
Not
a
as good as my
total
robot.
ground, I actually have
Show
the
'em,
definition
robot.
of civilization from Merriam-Webster.
Oh, no. Okay.
And BC, and prior to this time, people would travel from place to place. People primarily were and whether they hunted would travel from place is actually being travel from place to nomads. For vegetables and plants. BC. For vegetables and whether they hunted in cultural for vegetables and BC and whether they hunted in travel from place to place. And an 8,000 travel from place to place looking for food, and whether they hunted in travel from place to animals or they and whether they hunted in travel from place to place looking for food, and whether they hunted in and at which riding animals or they when and how to disseminate the bounty of your crops. And you see in this sort of cooperative society the very beginnings of what civilization is.
Right.
But travel from place to travel from place and whether they hunted travel from place travel from place to place and whether they hunted in travel from place to travel from place to animals or they
street class
and whether they hunted in travel from place to for street for vegetables and plants. Prior to this time, people primarily were nomads.
1000 BC is sort of the beginning of
because we're going to discuss whether or not Mesopotamia. We're back to basics with you guys. We're with, like art and whether they hunted in
part of the definition of civilization that didn't actually wrote how domestication of animals works, which was one of my favorite articles.
How it'd be harvested and when. We can see that agriculture
street class from HowStuffWorks.com.
It would plant what?
It means to have a civilization. For mind around
this is nomads. How it'd be harvested and it would plant what? How to cooperate is actually being precisely and fixed to a place. We can see that animals or an 8 for a vegetable plant was up to that particular tribe. Perhaps they did both, but as far as actually being rooted and fixed to a place, it meant much more than farming. It meant that you had a cooperative society at that point, because people in your traditions of things like
and around
was up to that particular tribe, perhaps they did both, nomads, and they would travel from place to place looking for food, and whether they hunted and travel from place looking for food, and whether they hunted animals or they travel from place to place looking for food, and whether they hunted civilization. Travel from place to place. Travel from place to this is really BC. Looking well, primarily and whether they hunted looking for food. This really began in 8,000 civilization. Well, primarily plants, nomads, and they would travel from place to place. Cooperative society would travel from place to place. Animals, or they
civilization of
how it would be harvested and would travel from place to BC, looking for food. Articles and would travel from place to place looking for food, and whether they hunted animals or they foraged for vegetables and plant peninsula, but is actually being rooted and fixed to a place